For years, nobody could explain it. Andy Griffith, the most beloved face in American television history, died on the morning of July 3, 2012. And before most of America had even heard the news, he was already in the ground. 4 hours and 53 minutes. No public funeral. No cameras. No farewell. The press called it suspicious. Fans called it a betrayal. But the truth behind those 5 hours has nothing to do with scandal, and everything to do with a man who spent 50 years giving America the version of himself it needed, while fiercely protecting the version that actually belonged to him. Who was the real Andy Griffith? Behind Mayberry? Behind that easy smile the cameras never stopped chasing. And after all these years, do we finally know why he was buried just 4 hours after he died? To understand those 5 hours, we have to go back to where it all began. There is a town in North Carolina called Mount Airy. Tucked into the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, it sits quietly at the edge of a world that modernity never fully claimed. Small streets, church steeples breaking the skyline, the smell of pine and red clay in the morning air, a place where neighbors still wave from porches, and where the pace of life moves at the rhythm of seasons, not screens. Andy Samuel Griffith was born there on June 1, 1926, and from the very first day, the world he entered was one of scarcity. His parents, Carl Lee Griffith and Geneva Nunn, were working people in the truest and most unforgiving sense of the word. Carl worked as a carpenter and factory hand, moving between jobs as the Depression-era South demanded. The family lived in a small house with no running water and no excess of anything. Not money, not space, not certainty about tomorrow. Andy shared a bedroom not just with siblings, but with the constant low hum of financial anxiety that filled homes like theirs in those years. What they lacked in material comfort, however, his parents tried to fill with faith and community. The Griffiths were devoted churchgoers, and it was inside those plain wooden walls that young Andy first discovered the thing that would define his entire life: his voice. Not just the sound of it, though that would come, but the power of it. The way a voice, shaped with intention, could hold a room, could make strangers feel known, could transform silence into something sacred. He sang in the church choir before he could fully understand the words he was singing. And even then, those who heard him paused. There was something in the timbre, warm, unhurried, rooted, that didn't sound like a child performing. It sounded like a man already comfortable in his own skin, even when everything around him said he had no reason to be. School offered him the first glimpse of what that voice could unlock. At Rockford Street Elementary, and later at Mount Airy High School, Andy was not the most academically decorated student. He was not the athlete, not the class president, not the boy whose trajectory seemed written in advance. But on stage, in the school plays and musical productions that most of his classmates treated as afterthoughts, he was something else entirely. He was the one people watched. His drama teacher, Ed Mickey, recognized it early and pulled Andy into every production he could. Later, Andy would speak about Mickey with the kind of reverence reserved for people who changed the direction of a life. The teacher who looked at a poor kid from a working-class home and said, without hesitation, "You have something." That something carried him to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a journey that, for a boy from his background, was less a natural progression than an act of audacious faith. He arrived in 1944, majoring in music, studying voice and trombone, absorbing everything an institution could offer a young man who had grown up with so little of it. But Chapel Hill gave him more than musical training. It gave him perspective. For the first time, Andy Griffith stood alongside young men and women from different worlds, wealthier worlds, more connected worlds, and realized something that would shape every professional decision he ever made. Talent was not the exclusive property of privilege, and the applause of an audience did not care about your father's income. After graduation, he returned briefly to teaching, a music teacher in Goldsboro, North Carolina. But the pull of performance was too strong and too constant to ignore. He began developing a comedic monologue act, a Southern storytelling routine built around the character of a country boy encountering the modern world with wide-eyed bewilderment and quiet wit. The most famous of these was What It Was Football, a comic monologue told from the perspective of a rural preacher stumbling upon a college football game and trying to make sense of it through the lens of a man who had never seen anything like it. Andy recorded it in 1953. It sold over 800,000 copies. Overnight, the poor boy from Mount Airy had a hit record, but it was Broadway that truly announced him. In 1955, Andy Griffith took the stage in No Time for Sergeants, playing the irresistibly naive Will Stockdale, a Georgia farm boy drafted into the Air Force, bewildering his superiors with an innocence so genuine it disarmed everyone around him. The show was a sensation. Critics fell over themselves. Audiences adored him. And Hollywood, which had been watching from a careful distance, moved closer. The 1957 film adaptation followed. Then, just 1 year later, Elia Kazan, one of the most respected directors in American cinema, cast Andy in a face in the crowd. A film so far removed from the warmth of Will Stockdale that it stunned everyone who saw it. He played Lonesome Rhodes, a drifter, a manipulator, a man who used his folksy charm to seduce the public into blind devotion, only to reveal, in private, a contempt for the very people who loved him. It was a performance of terrifying precision, dark, layered, and utterly convincing. Critics called it one of the finest screen debuts in a generation. And Andy Griffith, who had arrived in Hollywood as the lovable country innocent, proved in a single film that he was capable of something far more complex and far more dangerous. The tragedy, though no one called it that at the time, was that Hollywood didn't know what to do with that version of Andy Griffith. The darkness was real. The talent was undeniable. But the market wanted the warmth. The public wanted the innocence. And so, when a television producer named Sheldon Leonard approached him in 1960 with an idea for a small-town sheriff in a fictional North Carolina town called Mayberry, Andy made a decision that would define him for the rest of his life. He said yes. What Andy Griffith chose in 1960 wasn't just a television role, it was a trade. And like most trades made at the height of ambition, he wouldn't fully understand the cost until it was far too late to renegotiate. The Andy Griffith Show premiered on October 3, 1960. And from its very first episode, something happened that no network executive had fully anticipated, no ratings model had predicted, and no amount of industry experience could have prepared anyone for. America didn't just like it. America needed it. The show arrived at a moment of profound national anxiety. The Cold War hummed beneath every headline. The civil rights movement was fracturing the comfortable illusions of Southern life. Kennedy's election had energized the young and unsettled the old. The country was accelerating into a future it couldn't fully see. And in the middle of all that noise, Mayberry offered something almost impossibly rare: stillness. Sheriff Andy Taylor was not a hero in the conventional television sense. He carried no gun. He solved problems with patience rather than force. He raised his son Opie with a tenderness that fathers of that era rarely displayed on screen or off it. He was wise without being arrogant, funny without being cruel, principled without being rigid. He was, in short, everything America wanted to believe it was. For 8 seasons, the show dominated television. It finished #1 in the Nielsen ratings during its final season, a feat almost unheard of for a series in its last year. It produced one of the most beloved spin-offs in television history with Gomer Pyle. It launched careers, defined an era, and embedded itself so deeply into the cultural memory of the country that decades later, grown adults would still tear up at the sound of that whistled theme. But inside the warmth of Mayberry, something was quietly fracturing. Andy Griffith was not Sheriff Andy Taylor, and the distance between who he was and who the world needed him to be was growing wider with every season, every fan letter, every stranger who approached him in a grocery store and called him sheriff with a reverence usually reserved for the divine. Those who worked closely with him during those years describe a man of profound contradictions. Generous and volatile, warm and withholding, capable of extraordinary kindness one moment and a cold, cutting impatience the next. Don Knotts, his co-star and perhaps the closest friend of his professional life, once observed that Andy carried something heavy beneath the laughter, a kind of restlessness that the show's gentle pace could never fully contain. The first marriage to Barbara Bray Edwards, his college sweetheart, collapsed in 1972 after 20 years. Those who knew them said the pressure of fame had done its quiet, relentless work. The long absences, the weight of being a symbol, the impossible task of being a public treasure while remaining a private person. Their son, Andy Jr., known as Sam, would carry wounds from that fracture for decades. Their adopted daughter Dixie would speak rarely and carefully about those years when she spoke at all. A second marriage, to actress Solika Kasuto in 1973, lasted only 6 years before dissolving with equal quietness. 2 marriages, 2 failures, and a man increasingly convinced that the life the cameras showed and the life he actually lived were not just different. They were incompatible. He left the Andy Griffith Show in 1968, at its absolute peak, stunning the industry. Most stars cling to success with both hands. Andy walked away from it. He cited exhaustion, creative restlessness, the need to prove he was more than Mayberry. What followed was, by any honest measure, a decade of professional pain. His attempt to return to dramatic film with Angel in My Pocket in 1969 was met with indifference. A musical special here, a television movie there. None of it captured the cultural ignition he had known. Critics who had once praised his darkness in a face in the crowd now seemed to have forgotten that version of him existed. The public, meanwhile, only wanted one thing from Andy Griffith. They wanted him to come home to Mayberry. He resisted, and the resistance cost him. By the mid-1970s, Andy Griffith was a man in professional exile of his own making. Respected, but not relevant. Beloved, but not watched. He drifted through projects that never found their audience, carrying the particular loneliness of a man who had once been everywhere and was now, somehow, nowhere. And then, in 1986, came Matlock. Benjamin Matlock, a folksy, shrewd Atlanta defense attorney with a taste for hot dogs and a gift for courtroom theater, was in many ways a repackaging of what audiences had always loved about Andy Griffith. The warmth was there, the wit was there, the southern cadence, the unhurried confidence, the sense of a man who always knew more than he let on. But there was something sharper in Matlock, something that allowed Andy to bring the complexity he had never been permitted to show in Mayberry. The character could be calculating. He could be manipulative in the courtroom in ways Sheriff Taylor never was. He could carry moral ambiguity without losing the audience's fundamental affection. It ran for 9 seasons. It made him, improbably, a television star for the second time in his life. And it gave him something the Griffith Show years, for all their glory, had never quite provided. It gave him control. But even as Matlock restored his professional standing, the private battles were intensifying. In 1983, Andy Griffith was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare and terrifying neurological disorder in which the body's immune system attacks the peripheral nervous system. The paralysis it caused was not metaphorical. It was real, progressive, and, for a period, total. He lost the ability to walk. For a man whose entire identity was built on presence, on the power of being in a room, commanding a stage, filling a screen, the experience of lying immobile, uncertain whether his body would ever fully return to him, was a devastation that went far beyond the physical. He spoke about it rarely, and when he did, in careful, measured words, the fear that surfaced between the sentences was unmistakable. He recovered, slowly, painfully, incompletely. The illness left traces, a vulnerability in his physicality, a new and unwelcome awareness of mortality that never fully disappeared. Those who worked with him on Matlock in the years following his diagnosis noticed a man who moved through the world differently, more deliberately, more guardedly, as if the body he inhabited had become, in some fundamental way, less trustworthy than it once was. It was around this period that Andy Griffith began to speak more openly, at least in private, about the thing that had been building in him for decades: his need for invisibility. Not the invisibility of failure, which he had tasted in the 1970s and despised, but the invisibility of choice. The invisibility of a man who had given the public everything it asked of him for 30 years and now wanted, with a ferocity that surprised even those closest to him, to simply be left alone. He had watched what happened to celebrities who died publicly, the circus of it, the media encampment outside hospitals, the televised memorials that seemed designed more for the networks than for the families, the way grief became content, and a life became a news cycle, and a human being became, in death, exactly the kind of spectacle they had spent their living years trying to escape. He wanted none of it. In conversations with his wife, Cindy Knight, whom he had married in 1983, and who would become, by all accounts, the most stabilizing presence of his adult life, Andy made his wishes clear, not in the abstract way people speak about death when it feels distant, but with the specificity of a man who had thought it through carefully and arrived at a conclusion he was not willing to compromise. When he died, it would be private. It would be fast. It would be on Roanoke Island, where he had lived for years in a home that the press could never quite reach, surrounded by the salt air and the quiet of a coastline that felt nothing like Hollywood. And it would be over before the world had time to turn it into a show. What Andy Griffith asked of his family wasn't unusual for a private man. What was unusual was how completely they delivered it, and the extraordinary legal mechanism that made it possible. On the morning of July 3, 2012, Andy Griffith woke for the last time on Roanoke Island. He had been in declining health for some time. His heart, weakened by years and by the long shadow of the Guillain-Barré episode, was failing. Those closest to him had known for weeks that the end was near. There were no dramatic final scenes, no last-minute reconciliations staged for an audience, just the quiet diminishment of a body that had carried a remarkable life for 86 years. He died at home, with Cindy beside him, in the place he had chosen. What happened next was not improvised. It had been planned. North Carolina state law, at the time of Andy Griffith's death, permitted burial on private property under specific conditions. The regulations required permits. But those permits could be processed with extraordinary speed when the circumstances warranted. And the Griffith family, working with local officials who understood both the legal requirements and the extraordinary nature of the situation, moved with a precision that left the outside world no time to react. Within 5 hours of his death, Andy Griffith was buried on the grounds of his Roanoke Island property. No announcement had been made. No press release had been issued. No network had been tipped. By the time the news of his death reached the wider world, the burial was already complete. Journalists who rushed to Roanoke Island found nothing to photograph, nothing to film, nothing to turn into the spectacle Andy had spent his final years dreading. The reaction was immediate and deeply divided. Some fans were devastated. They felt robbed of the chance to say goodbye, as if the private burial had somehow denied them a relationship they had nurtured for decades through a television screen. Letters poured into newspapers. Online forums erupted with hurt and confusion. How could his family do this? Didn't he belong, in some sense, to all of us? Others understood instantly. They recognized in the speed and silence of that burial the final, definitive statement of a man who had always known the difference between the character the public loved and the person who lived behind it. Sheriff Andy Taylor belonged to Mayberry. Andy Griffith belonged to no one but himself. The people who felt hurt by that burial. They weren't wrong to feel it. But they were mourning the loss of Mayberry. Andy was protecting the man who had always lived just outside its borders. The legal mechanism that made it possible, the private property burial provision under North Carolina law, was not a loophole exploited in haste. It was a provision that existed precisely for situations like this, for families who wished to lay their dead to rest without the intervention of institutions or industries. Andy's team had researched it. His wishes had been documented. The execution was flawless. Ron Howard, who had played Opie Taylor as a child and who had remained close to Andy throughout his life, spoke with quiet grief about the burial in the days that followed. He did not criticize it. He understood it. That was Andy, he said simply. He did things his way. Don Knotts had died 6 years earlier, in 2006, and had been spared the knowledge of this final chapter. But those who knew both men well suggested that Knotts would have smiled at it, would have recognized in that swift private burial the same stubborn authenticity that had made Andy both magnificent and maddening to work with for a decade. Cindy Knight Griffith made no public statements in the immediate aftermath. She retreated into the same privacy her husband had always demanded, honoring not just his final wish, but the entire philosophy that had guided the last 3 decades of his life. The grave on Roanoke Island remains private. There is no public memorial, no museum exhibit marking the spot, no pilgrimage site for fans who make the journey to the Carolina coast hoping for something tangible to hold on to. There is only the island, the salt air, the sound of water against a shoreline that keeps its secrets with the same quiet resolve Andy Griffith kept his. There is a question that lingers long after the facts of Andy Griffith's burial have been absorbed and understood. A question that the facts alone cannot answer, because it lives not in the legal provisions or the family logistics or the timeline of those 5 extraordinary hours, but in the deeper territory of what fame costs, and what privacy means, and what a man owes the world that made him. Did Andy Griffith do the right thing? It depends entirely on which Andy Griffith you are mourning. If you are mourning Sheriff Andy Taylor, the man with the fishing pole and the patient smile, and the gentle wisdom that made Mayberry feel like a place you had actually lived, then perhaps the hurt is legitimate. That character was built from public love. It was sustained by public loyalty across 8 seasons and decades of reruns. It became, in the truest sense, a shared possession, a piece of American cultural memory that belonged not to one man, but to a nation that had wrapped itself in its warmth during some of its most turbulent years. That version of Andy Griffith, the argument goes, owed his audience something: a moment of acknowledgement, a final bow, a public farewell proportionate to the public devotion he had received. But if you are mourning Andy Samuel Griffith, the boy from Mount Airy who grew up with no running water, who discovered his voice in a church choir, who terrified audiences with his darkness in a face in the crowd before the industry decided it only wanted his warmth, then the burial makes not just sense, but profound, aching sense. That man had been giving himself away since 1960. Every season of The Andy Griffith Show was a negotiation between who he was and who the audience needed him to be. Every fan encounter was a small transaction in which he was asked to be Mayberry rather than himself. Every year of Matlock was a careful recalibration, trying to find the space between what the public wanted and what he still had left to offer. And through it all, the marriages that broke under the pressure, the illness that stripped him of his physical certainty, the professional wilderness of the 1970s, the slow accumulation of a lifetime spent being a symbol. Through all of it, what Andy Griffith wanted most was the one thing fame makes almost impossible: to be a private person, not a recluse, not a bitter exile, but a man who could walk to his own mailbox without becoming a headline, who could sit on his own porch without becoming a destination, who could die in his own bed without it becoming a broadcast. He had earned that, 50 years of earning it, one performance at a time. What Andy Griffith left behind wasn't just a television legacy. It was a lesson about the difference between the life we perform for others and the life that actually belongs to us. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to let those two things become the same. The deeper story of those 5 hours, the story beneath the logistics and the legal provisions and the stunned headlines, is the story of a man who spent his entire adult life watching fame consume the people around him and deciding, with cold clarity, that it would not consume him. He had seen what happened. He had watched colleagues and contemporaries lose themselves so completely in their public identities that by the end, there was nothing left to bury that wasn't already a performance. He had watched grief become entertainment. He had watched funerals become finales. He had watched the industry that had made him rich and recognizable treat the deaths of its luminaries as programming opportunities, as ratings events, as content for a news cycle that moved on within 48 hours, regardless of how loudly it had wept. He refused, and his refusal was not impulsive. It was not the panicked decision of a dying man suddenly terrified of exposure. It was the logical conclusion of a philosophy he had been building quietly for decades. The philosophy of a man who had always understood, with a clarity that fame usually destroys, the difference between what he did and who he was. What he did was perform, and he did it magnificently. 8 seasons of Mayberry, 9 seasons of Matlock, a recording career that began with a comedy monologue about football and evolved into gospel albums that sold quietly and steadily to audiences who found in his voice something that had nothing to do with television. Decades of craft, delivered with a consistency and a quality that the industry respected even when it took for granted. Who he was the boy from Mount Airy, the carpenter's son, the church choir singer, the young man who walked onto a Broadway stage with nothing but a voice and a story, and the stubborn conviction that he belonged there. The husband who failed twice before finding in Cindy Knight the partnership that actually held. The father whose relationships with his children carried the complicated weight of a man who was better at being present on a television screen than in a living room. That man, the real one, the flawed and complicated and fully human one, deserved a burial that reflected his actual life. Not the life Mayberry built for him, not the life the Nielsen ratings measured, not the life that would have played beautifully as a 2-hour memorial special on a major network, complete with archive footage and celebrity tributes and the whistled theme song swelling over a montage. His actual life, quiet, rooted, private, ending on an island in North Carolina with the woman he loved and the salt air he had chosen over everything the entertainment industry still had left to offer him. The grave is unmarked to outsiders. There is no plaque visible from any public road, no coordinates shared on any official website. Roanoke Island does not advertise itself as the final resting place of a television legend, because Andy Griffith did not want it to. The island is simply the island, ancient and indifferent, and entirely unconcerned with ratings. And somewhere in that indifference is the peace he spent a lifetime trying to find. Mount Airy, the town that was always Mayberry, whether it wanted to be or not, has a different relationship with his absence. The town that inspired the show, the barbershop modeled after Floyd's, the courthouse that echoes the one on television, the streets that still carry the quiet pride of having produced something the world needed, continues to honor him in the way small towns honor their own, with permanence rather than spectacle, with the kind of memory that doesn't require a camera to validate it. There is a statue. There are the annual Mayberry Days celebrations. There is the unmistakable sense, walking those streets, that something real happened here, that a real boy grew up on these real sidewalks and carried something of this place into every performance he ever gave, and that no matter how many years pass, the town and the man remain inseparable in a way that no burial, however swift, can dissolve. That is the paradox at the heart of Andy Griffith's story. He wanted privacy. He fought for it. He died for it, in the sense that the entire architecture of his final years was built around protecting it. And yet, the very things he created, the warmth of Mayberry, the folksy wisdom of Matlock, the voice on those gospel records, made true privacy impossible. Because the things he made were too good, too human, too deeply felt by too many people for the world to simply let them go when he did. He is private in death, but he is everywhere in memory. In every rerun that airs on a Sunday afternoon. In every child named Opie, by parents who wanted to give their son a name that meant something gentle and good. In every person who, under stress or grief, or the particular exhaustion of modern life, finds themselves humming a theme song they couldn't fully explain why they know. That is the legacy of a man who never wanted a legacy, who wanted only to be left alone, to live on his island, to walk to his mailbox without becoming a headline. He got what he wanted, and he left us everything we needed. The lesson Andy Griffith carried from that church choir in Mount Airy to the red Carolina soil of Roanoke Island is not complicated. It does not require analysis or interpretation. It is the kind of truth that announces itself quietly, the way the best truths always do. Fame is a costume. Wear it long enough and people forget you have a body underneath. The bravest thing you can do, in a world that wants to own you, is to remember that you don't belong to it. Andy Griffith remembered. Even at the end. Especially at the end. And 4 hours and 53 minutes after he drew his last breath on a summer morning in North Carolina, the earth closed over him. The cameras never came. The networks never got their finale. The spectacle never materialized. Just the island. Just the silence. Just a man. Finally and completely at peace. If this story moved you, If it made you think about the life you perform and the life you actually live, subscribe for more untold stories of the people who shaped our world. The real ones. The ones behind the cameras. The ones that don't make it into the highlight reels. Because those are always the stories worth telling.